I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, Ukraine hits Moscow with drone strikes for the second consecutive day. They also hit several industrial plants across Russia. Meanwhile, Moscow proposes a new round of ceasefire talks in Istanbul on June 2nd, and we discuss the memorandum that both Ukraine and Russia are drafting ahead of the meeting, and whether we'll see a change from Russia's maximalist stance from earlier this month. Finally, France's Dearnley sits down with Mykola Bielieskov of the National Institute for Strategic Studies.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 29th of May. 3 years and 95 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by James Rothwell, our Berlin correspondent, dialing in from Poland, and James Kilner, the Telegraph's former Russia correspondent, who is now the editor of the Central Asia and South Caucasus Bulletin and of the Russia Morning Memo. I will be covering the updates, the military updates today, instead of Dom, as Dom and Francis are both away from the office. I'm going to use Dom's favorite clock visualization technique, where we go around the clock and it locates geographically where the different advancements are. So, at 2 o'clock, Russian forces conducted offensive operations in Kursk Oblast on May 27th and 28th, with advances southeast in Novi Put. At 3 o'clock, Russian forces attacked north of Sumy city near Bilovody, Vodolahi, Volodymyrivka, Veselivka and Zhuravka. Toward Kindrativka and Oleksivka and northeast of Sumy city near Yunakivka, Lokhnya and Basivska. And then at 11, a Russian military blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces had counterattacked towards Tetkino, near the border with Ukraine. There have been a lot of Ukrainian hits on industry plants, conducted by a series of long-range drone strikes as well as drone attacks. All of this comes from the Institute of the Study of War and the General Staff of Ukraine's Armed Forces. Amongst the different hits, you have Kronstadt drone factory in Dubna in Moscow Oblast, which is a plant that produces cruise missiles. Also in Dubna in Moscow Oblast, several drones bypassed Russian air defenses near Raduga, and they've hit assembly and outfitting workshops of a plant, which was still afire as of 3 p.m. local time. Angstrom microelectronics plant in Zelenograd in Moscow Oblast, Dmitrievsky chemical plant in Ivanovo Oblast, Elmer Technological Park in Zelenograd in Moscow Oblast, and that's one of Russia's largest microchip manufacturing plants. It has been a critical hub for Russia to create plants in order to substitute imports because of the sanctions. And then finally, the Dubna machine building plant, which produces drones, avionics and control systems. A Russian opposition outlet, Astra, reported that Ukrainian forces had conducted a drone strike against the Murom instrument plant that produces ignition devices. Russia also reports a second day of Ukrainian drone attacks on Moscow. A building has been damaged outside of the capital, and it marks the second consecutive days of attack with multiple industrial facilities. No one has been injured. There have been videos and photos posted on social media by residents to show the damage sustained by a residential building purportedly on Vernadsky Avenue in southwest Moscow. On the Ukraine side of things, some hits on civilians. Russian attacks against Ukraine have killed 3 people and injured 27 others over the past day. That's regional authorities of Ukraine reporting. A man has been killed in the Bilopilia community in Sumy Oblast overnight, and a woman has been injured. Another person was killed in the village of Rivne in Donetsk Oblast. A Russian guided aerial bomb attack on the village of Verkhnya Tersa in Zaporizhia Oblast killed 1 person and injured another one. And the attacks have destroyed 5 houses, damaged 50 more, and about 600 homes were left without electricity. Ukrainian forces have downed 10 out of 90 drones, including Shahed-type drones launched by Russia overnight, and 46 drones were intercepted by electronic warfare or disappeared from radars without causing damage. Other military updates. One of the big headlines today is the return of almost half of the Azov fighters who were held prisoners in Russia. A total of 1,279 of the approximately 2,500 Azov fighters who were held in Russian captivity as prisoners of war have been returned to Russia since being captured. So that includes 455 from the Azov Brigade. That's from a spokesperson from the Ukrainian Coordination Headquarters for the Treatment of Prisoners of War. Now, this statistics includes soldiers from multiple units who fought to defend the Azov-style steel plant in Mariupol. You will remember this major battle and the most brutal of the entire war if you're a long-time listener to this podcast. Ukrainian society has rallied for captured Azov fighters. We had seen protests to bring back the fighters when we were in Ukraine last February when we were in Kyiv, and that's definitely been a major focus within Ukrainian civil society. There are still hundreds in captivity, and the lack of fighters from the Azov Brigade in the recent prisoners of war exchange has made a lot of people angry. There's a lot of social media outcry criticizing Ukrainian authorities for failing to return certain captives. Although Ukraine has advocated for all exchange, Russia has rejected that proposal. Colonel Denis Prokopenko, a commander of the Azov National Guard Brigade, described the 1,000 for 1,000 exchange as a mockery due to the lack of fighters from the Azov Brigade. That was in a post on Facebook. Ukraine's security services, the SBU, has charged a captured Russian Marine for war crimes for allegedly executing 2 unarmed Ukrainian prisoners during operations earlier this year. The soldier was a rifleman in Russia's 40th Separate Marine Brigade, and he's accused of participating in point-blank shooting of 2 detained Ukrainian servicemen. There are investigations from Ukraine's Prosecutor General Office that are underway in the execution in 268 Ukrainian prisoners of war, generally speaking. That man has been formally charged by Ukraine's criminal code with war crimes, including violations of the Geneva Convention concerning the treatment of prisoners of war, and if convicted, he could face life imprisonment. Now, moving on to Russia's military recruitment, the Washington Post has reported that Russia will likely be able to continue its current tactics of gradual creeping advances because Russia's Security Council Deputy Chairperson, so Dmitry Medvedev, has claimed that almost 175,000 people have arrived at military units and that more than 14,000 people have joined volunteer units since the start of 2025. So that's roughly 1,285 people per day. Medvedev has also reiterated Putin's May 13 claim that 50,000 to 60,000 people voluntarily join the Russian military per month. Putin's claim is notably higher than Medvedev's, and the Institute of the Study of War, where I got these numbers, said they cannot independently verify these claims. If we balance that with the number of losses, Russia has suffered a loss rate of 1,550 people per day since January 2025. And so the claim that 175,000 soldiers from Medvedev that have joined Russian military since January 2025 would indicate that Russia is replenishing the units at about a 1-for-1 ratio to its loss rate. Final couple of updates from me. Germany Chancellor Friedrich Merz has said, following a meeting with Zelensky, that Germany will finance a significant portion of Ukraine's Starlink satellite system operation costs. They have announced they would supply Ukraine with ammunition, small arms, air defense, land weapon system, and invest 5 billion euros in Ukraine's defense industrial base. We'll come back to that later in the show with James. And finally, latest note, also from the Institute of the Study of War, about a military exercise in Belarus. So the defense minister from Belarus, Lieutenant General Viktor Krenin, announced in an English-language social media post on May 28th that Belarusian officials decided to reduce the scope of a joint military exercise called Zapad 2025 and relocate the main maneuver away from the western border of Belarus and towards the center of Belarus. They have made this decision, they claim, to demonstrate Belarus's readiness for de-escalation, dialogue and peace. Belarusian authorities would not have been able to make that decision independently without Russia. Russia and Belarus are attempting to posture themselves as unthreatening, reasonable, and cooperative towards the West. That's for the military updates today, folks. I'm going to turn to James Rothwell for the diplomatic updates. James, what have you got for us?
Thanks, Adélie. Well, let's move to the diplomatic updates, and we'll look ahead to another round of diplomacy, which is coming next week on June the 2nd. Moscow has proposed June the 2nd as a date for the next round of talks with Ukraine in Istanbul. That's been confirmed by the Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, at a press conference. Now, those talks, of course, are going to be a continuation of a process that started back in Istanbul in May 16, when a key document, a memorandum, was drawn up. Dmitry Peskov, who's as we all know, the spokesperson for the Kremlin, said that a personal meeting between Zelensky and Putin is fundamentally possible, but he added that it must be based upon, quote, specific agreements between the two sides. Now, this memorandum, which I mentioned earlier, is basically a process of trying to draw up some kind of provisional agreement and send that to each other in order to lay out, I suppose, you might call it a roadmap. I'm going to quote directly from Lavrov himself with a bit more information on that point. He said, "In Istanbul, it was agreed that Moscow and Kyiv would prepare documents setting out the positions of each side to reach a sustainable solution. The Russian side," still quoting Lavrov here, "as agreed, promptly drafted a corresponding memorandum which lays out our position on all sides of reliably overcoming the root causes of the crisis." Now let's go over to the Ukrainian side. We've got a report from the Kyiv Independent, which says that, according to Ukraine's defense minister, Rustem Umerov, Kyiv is actually still waiting for Russia's proposed ceasefire memorandum. Unfortunately, the Russian side attempted to delay this process, but pressure worked, said Umerov. They received our document, Umerov added, referring to a Ukrainian position paper, and he said, "We reaffirm Ukraine's readiness for a full and unconditional ceasefire and continued diplomatic engagement." He went on to say that Ukraine is open to the idea of having additional meetings, but he also said it's very important that there can be a level of preparedness, that they get advance notice so that they can get their ducks in a row, I suppose, to make sure that those discussions are productive. And I'll just end with a quick quote from him. "The Russian side has at least 4 more days, so that's until June the 2nd, before their departure to provide us with their documents for review. We call on them to fulfill that promise without delay and stop trying to turn the meeting into a destructive one. Diplomacy must be substantive and the next meeting must yield results." And I think you can pick up there from that reference to a meeting potentially being destructive from the Ukrainian side, that they are, as always, going into these talks with quite a skeptical eye and ear. Let's now go over to US President Donald Trump. Why not? I just want to bring up something that's come out from the American side, actually, which is that May 28th, that's when Mr. Trump said this, the US would know soon whether President Vladimir Putin is serious about ending the war in Ukraine, warning that if Moscow continues to stall the process, Washington might, quote, respond a little bit differently. So that's a shadow, perhaps, of an ultimatum coming from the Trump administration, speaking on May the 28th. Trump also said that Steve Witkoff, that's his special envoy, is having ongoing negotiations with the Russian side, and in sort of characteristic Trump fashion, he praised his special envoy as doing a phenomenal job. I'll just give you another quote from Trump just to flesh this out a little bit. He said, "We're going to find out very soon. It'll take about 2 weeks or a week and a half." And he was speaking to reporters during a briefing. So a lot of paperwork by the sounds of it, Adélie. There's a lot of back and forth in terms of getting the right documents in order ahead of some more crucial talks in Istanbul. I'm just going to pick up some reporting from Reuters as well, which is relevant to this. 3 Russian sources familiar with the peace negotiations have told Reuters that Putin wants Western states to submit a written pledge, a commitment, basically, that NATO will not expand further eastward. They're also asking for, and these demands will sound very familiar indeed to our listeners, Ukrainian neutrality, sanctions relief. They want Russian assets in the West to be unfrozen. And they're also asking for what they characterize as protections for Russian speakers in Ukraine. And, we're looking at a sort of wider dynamic here where the Kremlin is obviously not only just sort of totally opposed to the idea of Ukraine joining the NATO security alliance, but, inevitably they are trying to get the maximum possible concessions that they can get. They're no doubt hoping, perhaps due to the presence of Trump in the White House, that they might be able to get better concessions than they'd initially hoped, as they have for some time. Quite an interesting line from Reuters, actually. A source said to Reuters news agency that Putin is less inclined now to make territorial compromises, and he's continuing to demand the entirety of Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Luhansk and Kherson, those Ukrainian oblasts. And he even wants areas that Russian forces don't currently occupy as part of his demands. And this source that spoke to Reuters has interpreted this as another sign that Putin has, quote, toughened his position about that crucial issue of territorial negotiation during any possible ceasefire. Also end, I think, with some remarks from Vladimir Putin himself. This is sort of classic kind of historical hyping up, you might say, from Putin. Russian border guards have developed their legendary, he says, traditions throughout a proud 1,000-year history of Russia. He says since the time of ancient Rus, I think he must be referring to the Rus of Ukraine, that proud Viking nation from distant history. And of course, this is more rhetoric from Putin, which is basically trying to characterize Ukraine as being Russian rather than Ukrainian. We've seen it before, and I'm sure we'll see it again. Putin was, however, also talking about current events. He said he's confident that border guards will keep repelling threats to Russia and attempts to cross the state border. He's, of course, referring to Ukrainians defending their country from the full-scale military invasion there. And Putin and other Russian officials, they are sort of promising the Russian population that conscripts who are basically mandated to serve in the military at the moment won't be deployed to fight in Ukraine. So that's most of the diplomatic updates that we've had so far. Adélie?
Thanks, James. And so you've been dispatched to Poland, I gather, in the last few days. Do you want to first paint a bit of a picture of where you are, what you've been up to, and what's the mood over there?
Thanks, Adélie. So yes, I'm in Warsaw. I'm reporting on the Polish presidential elections. The runoff is happening this Sunday. It's an election that will choose a new president for Poland, a largely ceremonial role, but one that does wield quite a lot of political power here. The president of Poland can veto laws that he doesn't like, and he can also delay, potentially indefinitely, other laws that he doesn't like via various councils. And so the dynamic here is that we've got a government led by Donald Tusk, the centrist leader of Poland, pro-European, and of course very pro-Ukrainian. And he is hoping that his preferred centrist candidate from the Civic Platform party will emerge from this election as the victor. That would open the door to the Tusk government being able to pass all of the reforms that it likes. And the Tusk government has, for example, proposed liberalisation of abortion laws in Poland, which are some of the toughest in Europe. It also wants to liberalise rules on civil partnerships. And so they're hoping that this centrist candidate from the Civic Platform will win the elections on Sunday. But they've got very, very, very stiff competition from a right-wing rival presidential candidate, Karol Nawrocki, who is also pro-Ukrainian, but also quite Eurosceptic. And he's not offering a fundamental change of direction for Ukraine on some of the issues that this podcast would consider really important, like military support for Ukraine. I spent a week here. I very much get the impression that support for Ukraine here in Poland is basically universal. But symbolically, having that right-wing anti-Tusk candidate winning this election is going to be a problem for Tusk in terms of passing the sort of flagship policies of his government. There's a risk that they could be vetoed. I've spoken to some Polish analysts this week who say that if Nawrocki, the right-wing candidate, wins the election, it could even hasten or bring about the fall of Mr. Tusk's government. On the security issues, again, just want to stress this because I know Polish listeners will feel quite strongly about this. There's a lot of common ground here, but on issues like social issues, socially conservative issues in particular, in terms of economic reform, in terms of the relationship with Europe, especially, Tusk is obviously a former EU Council president, and his candidate in the presidential elections is also very pro-EU, whereas Nawrocki is very Eurosceptic. That speaks more, I think, to the flavour of this election. It's about the tone of the Polish leadership. It's about the overall direction that Poland is heading in terms of its relationship with Europe, in terms of its national economy. And the results are going to be really close. It's going to be probably one of the sort of tensest and most narrowly run elections, certainly of the year so far, possibly of the whole year. Barely a couple of percentage points in it, according to the opinion polls. And we won't get the full results probably until Monday morning. So big moment for Polish politics. In particular, a big question as to whether they want a president who's very Eurosceptic, or like the Prime Minister Donald Tusk, they want a president who's much more of a sort of close friend to Brussels.
Thanks, James. How long are you going to be in Poland for? Are you staying until Sunday?
I will be heading back to Berlin on Friday, but Telegraph readers can look forward to an election dispatch, which is going to flesh out some of the themes that we've talked about on the podcast today. And I'm also working on a sort of state of the nation piece about Poland. That's at the risk of using a journalist buzzword. It's a deep dive, which is going to be looking at how Poland has become so successful in terms of its military, in terms of its diplomacy, in terms of its economy. Spoiler alert, membership of the EU, of course, played a very significant role in that. And that is why, even though there's a lot of Euroscepticism in Poland, you are very unlikely to find Poles over here who want to actually leave the EU. And yes, we'll be keeping a very close eye on the election results. And I can almost guarantee, that if you go to the Telegraph website on Monday morning, you won't only get the election results, but we're inevitably going to be working on a story about what all of this means for Europe, depending on who emerges from that election as the victor.
That's great. And we'll definitely be talking about that and that report on Monday as well on the pod. Thank you, James. Now, turning to James Kilner, you wanted to talk to us about Zelensky's weapons deal with Germany and how that's been reported.
Yeah, sure. So it was really just to pick up on a couple of things that you and James were talking about earlier in the pod, to look at the same issues from the Russian perspective from Moscow, which is what I spent a lot of my time doing. The headlines this week have been mainly about the increase in Ukrainian drone attacks into Russia, or so they claim anyway, over the last few days. The Russian Air Force said it shot down nearly 300 drones on Tuesday night, Wednesday morning. Very hard, obviously, to fact check this. But they're talking about an increase in drone attacks. And they're now linking it up with this rather large deal that Germany did with Ukraine yesterday, giving them the right to build long-distance weapons, missiles in Kiev. They're now saying that the Russian media has now gone to town on this, saying that this now puts Moscow and other Russian cities within striking distance of Ukrainian missiles, etc. And they're very much framing this as part of the bloodthirsty plot to undermine Russia, talking about how Germany wants to have a second go at taking out Russia, having failed in World War II. We know all about the Kremlin's propaganda framing its war in Ukraine as a crusade against the Nazis and linking it back to his victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. The media has really picked up on this again with these apparent uptake in drone strikes and this rather large military deal between Germany and Ukraine in sort of base terms. That's how they're framing it. Importantly, they're not including the US in this bloodthirsty pact. Since Trump took power, the Russian propaganda around America has completely changed. They see Trump as an ally now, and Europe and Ukraine is the real bloodthirsty enemy. Now this, as Russia and Ukraine jostle for positions around potential next round of peace talks, Russia's pushed for it to happen in Istanbul again, as James was saying, the missile deal between Germany and Ukraine and this apparent increase in drone attacks inside Russia, which incidentally does seem to have hit Russia's biggest microchip manufacturer and also an arms producer over the last few days. But this whole narrative that the Kremlin media has produced allows Putin to posture once again as the peacemaker, as a sensible peacemaker. Of course, this is not true, but the Kremlin narrative, the slick Kremlin propaganda has been pushing this message for a month, 6 weeks now. If you remember back to when the cameras were allowed into Putin's alleged apartment inside the Kremlin, there was a carefully positioned picture of Alexander III, Tsar Alexander III, who's nicknamed the Peacemaker. That's no accident. So here we go again with the Kremlin media allowing Putin to show himself off as sort of a reasonable, even-handed peacemaker chap. And they went to town. The PR machine even went to town further this week with Putin's sort of soft image coming across when there was a televised moment with Putin listening to some officials talking about how to roll out, spreading digitalization in Russia, doing more things on the internet, etc. One of Putin's officials, his underlings, piped up and said, it might be a good idea if Russians could start sending out marriage proposals online for a special online portal. We can get the whole thing speeded up and then get younger people married off earlier and having more babies, which is what the Kremlin wants to do. Putin was able to stand in and go, no, this is terribly unromantic. It's much better for long term if people do this in person, can look each other in the eyes and, quote, experience certain emotions, unquote. So a very sort of planted aside there about Putin and about how the Kremlin is working so hard to make Putin look human and sort of shift the narrative from wartime leader, really, to peacemaker and human. With that in mind, one particular headline in one of the Russian newspapers caught my eye this morning. James was talking about the Reuters report about Putin and the Kremlin underlying, his 4 principles around pushing towards a peace deal. Now, these principles apparently haven't changed. They're the same things. No NATO for Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, protection of Russian speakers' rights, lifting sanctions and territorial claims, etc. Clearly hasn't changed. And one of the sources that James quoted said that he thought that Putin had doubled down on his demand for Ukraine to hand over the entirety of Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, as well as Donetsk and Luhansk, which Russian forces almost have the entirety of Donetsk and Luhansk, but they don't over Zaporizhia and Kherson. Yes, these have been Russian claims, but a headline in one of the newspapers this morning suggested, now I use this in the most tentative way, I don't want to set people off, but it suggested there may be some wiggle room here. The report was about the timing of the second round of peace negotiations, which look like they're going to happen in Istanbul on June the 2nd, and how Russia had pushed for this, etc., because in the Kremlin's eyes, in the Kremlin newspaper eyes, they're the reasonable party. And this was being reported under the headline, quote, the conditions under which Russia could renounce claims to Kherson and Zaporizhia. Now, I've not seen this before. I just flagged this up as a interesting aside because I just have not seen this before. Russian media is very tightly controlled. It's often used by the Kremlin to road test policies, to get sort of public reaction to various policies. This may or may not be happening in this incident. And it could just be a brave or overworked or reckless headline writer planting this sort of notion in its readers' minds. We are reading the tea leaves. We're always trying to read the tea leaves a bit in what's going on in Russia and the criminology. And I think little signifiers like this are just worth picking up. I'm not saying it's going to change the situation, but it is something just to be aware of. Reuters is quoting someone who says there's going to be no flexibility in territorial demands from Russia. I've seen a headline which suggests in a mainstream newspaper that there may be some wiggle room. But Adélie, that is something for us to sit on and see. The only other issue at the moment that I wanted to pick up on is a point you made about recruitment numbers in Russia. Now, Zelensky was talking about it this week, recruitment data. He reckoned Russia was recruiting about 40,000 soldiers a month, compared to Ukraine's about 23,000, I think it was. To put it in the context for your listeners, 40,000 is roughly half the size of the British Army every month being recruited into Russia. It's absolutely astonishing. As we know, one of the biggest draws for this huge recruitment are these one-off bounties that men get for signing up to fight in Ukraine. This week, we had a new record for the region in Russia offering the highest bounty for men to sign up. So this is Khanty-Mansiysk region in Siberia is now offering 2.65 million rubles as a signing on bonus for men, up from 2.2 million rubles. On top of this, there's various smaller top-ups from the federal government and some other municipal bounties, etc., which basically push the final tally. You will receive a bonus of 3.2 million rubles, which is about $40,000 or 25 times higher than the average monthly salary in the region. So absolutely enormous. This is a huge reason why the Russian recruitment levels are still so astonishingly high.
I think you mentioned before the pod that you wanted to talk about Putin and potatoes. Do you want to tell me more what you had in mind?
Yeah, Putin and potatoes. This is not about his preferred lunch. This is about him earlier this week apparently making a phone call to his mate in Belarus, Lukashenko, the president down there, asking him if there's anything he can do about a potato shortage in Russia and whether he can increase exports to Russia. I've spoken about the potato, the sort of twofold, threefold increase in the price of potatoes in Russia this year. It varies from region to region. And this is basically because of poor crop, a lack of interest because it's so expensive to get fuel, labour is more expensive, all this sort of stuff has led to a huge shortage of potatoes, a staple food in Russia. And I've spoken about this before on the pod. But what is interesting is Putin talking about this. To my mind, this is perhaps the first or certainly one of the only times he's spoken about it in public. It's meant to be a public reference to his sort of caring nature like that. He's now caring about ordinary people who are suffering high inflation. This is a signifier that Putin has noted there's an inflation problem and he wants to do something about it. With that in mind, try and make the point that it is important to look at the economy in Russia because it is an Achilles heel for Putin. If you take away the war economy, which is now a huge part of the actual total economy, it's floundering, and it's floundering quite badly. You can argue each way this may mean that Putin has to end the war sooner rather than later so he can concentrate on repairing the civilian economy, or you could argue that he needs the war economy to keep going, to prop up this injured civilian economy. Either way, it's on a knife edge, and we've got to try and work out what's going on. The Russian central bank has an interest rate meeting on June the 6th. Interest rates are at 21% in Russia, which is causing huge problems, not least in the mortgage side of things and the construction sector, but it's just too expensive for people to borrow money, etc. The economy is basically choking. But Russian analysts, economists have started talking for the first time in a while. These interest rates were jacked up in November last year to support the very weak ruble at the time. But analysts are now saying there is the opportunity now for the central bank to start relaxing interest rates. They're split on whether it's going to happen next week or a bit later, but they said that conditions are beginning to allow the central bank to do this. The ruble strengthened, there's potentially a peace deal on the way, etc., and inflation is softening just a little bit. So they said, this could be down the line. The flip side of that is that the civilian economy, the data that comes in is still increasingly poor. To make the point, there's two pieces of data that I found just from today, reading through the Russian newspapers this morning. Russia's largest producer of tractors is saying that sales of tractors and combine harvesters in the first 4 months of the year were down by about a third. That's a huge indicator of the state of the economy and also particularly the state of farming. We know that farming is really struggling in Russia under all the labour and fuel price pressures. And the second piece of data is about fridges. So the number of fridges being sold in Russia now is down about 10% from this time last year. 10% is an indicator that the economy is a bit softer, but it's not hugely down. It's 10% down. It's not a third down or whatever. But there's another piece of detail in that data which suggests that overall expenditures on fridges, normal household white good, is down. The most popular fridge bought in Russia now is one that was produced in Russia. It's overtaken a Chinese import fridge, which had been the most popular for a year or two before. And the reason is, again, it's cheaper. Fridges and tractors are again highlighting the ailing state of the Russia's civilian economy.
And now, let's turn to a conversation between Francis and Mykola Bielieskov of the National Institute for Strategic Studies under President Zelensky. He also works for the Ukrainian charity Come Back Alive as a senior analyst. Here's their conversation.
So tell me about your role, Mykola, and how you got to being in London this week.
That was an opportunity in the course of my visit to Berlin. So since I have some meetings, some conferences in Berlin, I also take a chance to come here. And here I have a number of informal and formal meetings. So it's a usual itinerary for the analysts. So you meet with your peer colleagues, analysts responsible for Russia-Ukraine war, security in general, in a number of think tanks. Also, you meet media, which also cover the whole story, and also an opportunity to meet with people in government who are responsible for conducting bilateral relations and also arranging bigger support for Ukraine of this international coalition. So it's a ordinary itinerary for Ukraine analyst who is responsible for covering war in these times.
And your analysis, I know you were saying before we started recording that you spoke to David previously about Ukrainian grand strategy or the absence thereof. Just remind us of your expertise and what your particular focuses are at the moment.
Right now I'm affiliated with two entities. One is non-governmental one. I'm proud to be a member of a team of a Comeback Alive. Comeback Alive is the biggest non-governmental charity that exists since 2013. Which aid armed forces of Ukraine. We are proud to raise more than $350 million since the big war started. And along with purchasing and distributing hardware, both lethal and non-lethal, we also do analysis. And I'm doing strategic studies analysis at Comeback Alive. So we are responsible in synthesizing lessons out of the present combat and then thinking to what extent they would be useful and in what ways they would be useful for the future of the armed forces of Ukraine. So what kind of armed forces we can have and could afford, proportionate to everything that we've seen since 24th of February 2022. So basically it's a strategic analysis, and I'm also affiliated with National Institute for Strategic Studies. It's a Ukrainian governmental think tank attached to the Office of the President at National Security and Defense Council, and its job also to provide advice and expertise on a whole range of issues, the whole range of governance issues. I'm also there with the Defense Policy Department, but mostly at National Institute for Strategic Studies, I track current combat and explain it every 2-week video podcast. So that's my job, more limited at National Institute for Strategic Studies and more extensive at Comeback Alive.
And what's your assessment of the military picture at the moment based on your analysis?
Though most attention is concentrated on negotiations for obvious reason, there is a lot of reporting, but as for me, it's a sideshow because of the stakes, because of the interest as they defined by both Ukraine and Russia, and there is no room for compromise. Thus, combat is as important, and combat would determine actually the relative strengths of negotiations positions both of Ukraine and Russia, and thus we should pay much attention to the combat that is ongoing. And actually we entered a period of most intense combat, which happened during a year from May till September or May till October, and 2025 unfortunately is not going to be a major difference compared with 2022, 2023 and the last year. And both sides understand the stakes, and thus we can expect another bloody campaign where Russians would rely on expendable infantry, trying to treat and overwhelm Ukrainian position, also their relative advantage in firepower. So they would be on offensive, we would take active defense, so-called, and thus most important component is not negotiations, but actual combat that is happening along the front lines. I'm pretty sure that this year Russians again would stick to the Donetsk region as their immediate target, and both sides employ to a great extent tactics that were developed and polished during 2023, 2024. So there's a lot of non-contact warfare, so-called, relying on constant intelligence, UAVs, also classic artillery, with the goals of undermining its own logistics, medical support, reinforcements, and creating dilemmas for each other. So it would be all of the same with a lot of losses, unfortunately.
I'm sure you will have seen former Commander-in-Chief Zaluzhny's comments recently about the way in which warfare has been fundamentally evolved. And of course, it's something we've discussed many times on the podcast previously, and the way in which the drone wall is transforming warfare. I wonder, he's, in his arguments, pushing for technological innovation as being the key to perhaps, if not breakthrough, shifting the dial more in Ukraine's and the West's favour. I wonder what your assessment of that perspective is. Is that likely? Do you think technology holds the key, or what are the other weapons that could be given?
We can look at the current situation from the lenses of previous history, especially World War I. So the technologies that eventually ensured the breaking through were already present in 1960s, 1970s. So the things that we've seen in 1918, it was thanks largely to the new quality of troops orchestration. So the fact that we finally found modern combined armed warfare. So in my opinion, again, that's my private opinion, I'm not the one in authority and experience to challenge General Zelensky. In my opinion, most of the technologies that would be instrumental in returning movement in warfare are already present. But the trick is to combine them at scale, and it combines them in simultaneity. And it turned our attention to the major issue that I think a lot of people are missing, because we mostly concentrate on technology, which is important, because technology constantly evolves, and without technologies you can't have anything. But this is humans who conduct war, and this is humans who win in a war. And for UAV employment, you still need operators. You still need those who program all of these things. So the major problem is not only to find proper sequence of technologies, proper sequence of effects, so-called, as it's said, but to do it at scale and in simultaneity. And it requires a proficiency of the troops. It requires proficiency of officers, non-commissioned officers. And this is precisely the area where both sides were affected, and especially Ukraine was affected, because in 2022, one of our biggest asymmetrical advantage was skilled manpower. Then Russia diluted this advantage thanks to advantage in firepower. And right now our biggest challenge is to bring proficiency, to improve proficiency of our own troops, because only troops employ this weaponry. So in my humble opinion, most of the technologies that would bring mobility to the war already exist. The problem is how to employ them at scale and simultaneity.
Can you talk a little bit more about what those technologies are? Break it down for us.
Well, there is another difference, but we can use World War I as a starting point. So in World War I, Germans in 1918, they employed just two branches. It was artillery and infantry. Allies were more technologically sophisticated, thus they bring also, along with artillery and infantry, they bring also main battle tanks. First generation, they also bring preponderant air power. Right now, along with these branches, which also evolved and developed in World War II and post-World War II, we have also air defenses and missile defenses. We have electronic warfare and electronic intelligence. We have also command and control infrastructures like a Delta system developed by Ukrainian entities. So we have a couple of times bigger amount of branches, starting from infantry, which is still important, then armors and artillery, then air defenses and air power, and then electronic intelligence and electronic warfare, and then in command and control systems that unite everything. So you see, the major problem is that number of branches you need to employ multiplied, and it requires either sophistication of command and control, of which, by the way, General Zelensky reminded in one of his articles for Defense One, talking about Delta and its role, and the fact that even some NATO countries are interested. But in general, it requires even more sophisticated, more developed human capital to orchestrate this. So that's the challenge. And when it was 2023, for instance, Ukrainian offensive in southern Ukraine, back at that time, we didn't manage to undermine Russian self-reinforcing system of defense that relied on the air defense to undermine our kill chain, intelligence capacity, also electronic warfare, which did the same. And then, of course, attack helicopters, and then, of course, classic artillery, plus UAVs, plus people with anti-tank guided missiles. And unfortunately, we didn't manage to crack this nutshell. So that's the major problem, basically, how to undermine this. And then there is a problem of sequencing effect, so-called. So you first, for instance, need to make your opponent to switch on air defense, then destroy air defense, so your UAVs can operate more freely, then undermine electronic warfare, or in counter-battery fight undermines your artillery. So it's also the problem of sequencing, how you start and then how you proceed. You see, there is a lot of challenges.
Zelensky's successor, Zelensky, was saying a few weeks ago that the Russian summer offensive, or spring offensive, should I say, had already begun around Sumy. What do you think the Russian capability is in 2025? Do you think there is, as some pessimists have said, that a prospect of some quite major offensive and breakthrough, or do you think that we're just going to see a continuation of this grinding until something does profoundly change, whether it be politically or militarily?
Well, first of all, Russians managed to increase armed forces, a grouping of forces that is employed against Ukraine, despite the losses. So last year it was 500,000, now it's 620,000, despite losses. So they managed to compensate for their dead and wounded, and last year they lost more than 400,000 dead and wounded. They managed to compensate with new recruits, thanks to the payments. And the net increase every single month, according to Ukrainian intelligence, it's 8, 9, 10,000 a month. So Russians increase their grouping of forces, and probably they would try to pin down Ukrainian attention along the front line, along Sumy axis, for instance. And then I still suppose that their main attack axis would be either Pokrovsk or now it's Konstantinivka direction already. Because these are mutually reinforcing, and then if you are successful there, then you create the ground for eventual strikes, which would target Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, the biggest and the last major urban area. So I think that it would probably resemble the last year fighting. So there is a capability out of Russians in terms of manpower, but right now there is no indication thus far that they would manage to crack our own system of defense. Thus it would be like the same expendable infantry thrown out continuously on Ukrainian position to create dilemma for the forward unit commanders when you have Russian slowly accumulating their forces on the flanks of your position through infiltration, plus constantly attacking you through firepower, undermining your logistics, medical evacuation, and all of the things. And then you have a dilemma whether to stick to this position or to withdraw, do so-called tactical realignment. And then Russians would like to exploit this. So I think it would probably remain the last year fighting. There was an assessment done by General Kavoli a number of times that neither side would be able to orchestrate a major breakthrough. And it means first and foremost Russian inability to attain these goals, because Ukraine is already on defensive mode of action overall, the front line. And that's, by the way, is explained by the fact that we operate maybe differently to a certain extent, but the same list of technologies. So there is no silver bullet in either side's possession. So there is no kind of a major surprise that other side can employ and undermine the whole system of defense. So I think with all this year fight would be quite similar to the last year fight, including the geography, because Russians last year, if we recall, has major success in southern Donetsk region. And yes, they might try to push to the Sumy region and even try to get to the Sumy itself, but it won't give them a major leverage, unlike trying to take control of Pokrovsk and then impact people perceptions through the fact that now we are on the gates of Dnipropetrovsk region. So I think Sumy is important and other axes are important, but Russians would concentrate on Donetsk region.
I'll come to your perspective on what an American withdrawal or reduction of support for Ukraine would mean and the prospect of Europe filling that gap. But first, I just want to ask, we've had many journalists on the ground speaking to soldiers on this podcast, and a critique that sometimes comes up is that there remain the vestiges of a Soviet-style mentality in the Ukrainian armed forces. I think we've spoken about it many, many times in the Russian context, but less so in the Ukrainian context. But could you comment on that and maybe break that down a little bit for us? What vestiges of that time are there still in the Ukrainian military, which has become increasingly westernized over the years?
Well, let's start from conditions that create this complicated situation. So it's not that universally problematic, but we at the same time can deny the problem. So the major problem is that it's a war of attrition and it negatively affects professionalism. So the best and the brightest are lost, either physically or just been worn out. And then, unfortunately, some people with a Soviet experience or post-Soviet experience are promoted. There is a lot of officers who retired before 2014 even. And then they are recalled, since they are reservists nominally and zero age allowed this, so they are returned. And then, of course, we have a situation when the balance between Western and post-Soviet change in a favor of post-Soviet in relative terms. Again, it's not that post-Soviet approaches are predominant. So the major problem is that till we stabilize the situation in terms of Russia leveraging its firepower, this tendency, unfortunately, might tend to aggravate. That's a problem. Well, it's all about treating your own troops to your own subordinates. So there is a good examples like of the 3rd Assault Brigade or number of National Guard brigades that are now used as a basis to create core system. Basically, when human capital is treated in a right way. So first people are prepared properly, then they commanded properly, and they treated in a proper way when they are not assigned the tasks that they are not able to deliver. And there are approaches, unfortunately, with some old-fashioned people that they are kind of yes men to their superiors when they take some kind of assignment that they are not able to deliver, and then their subordinates are the one who bear the negative consequences. So this is an uneven situation, but it's a natural result of all of the negative sides of Western approach, for instance, like delivering weaponry by beats in 2022 when time was ripe for major strikes targeting Russia. So unfortunately, it's a negative consequences, but expected consequences. And only thing we can do in investing in proper segments of Ukrainian armed forces, in investing into initiatives like Comeback Alive have, which is a school of captains. We support the educational initiative, which train tactical level officers, which work at the company level, battalion level. So that's the only way forward.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Well, let's turn then to, in many ways, the issue of the moment, which is the prospect of America, if not withdrawing, reducing its support and the potential ramifications of that for Ukraine. What's your assessment of that and the impact that it would have on the battlefield? And what could Europe do?
Well, we should prepare for this contingency, because I see the tendency that some people treat recent statements of Trump administration, including J.D. Vance, in positive way. For sure, if they turn their mind and come to accept that aid in Ukraine is the only way, that's fine. But we should proceed from the worst-case scenario where even if Trump administration remains involved in these negotiations, there is no further aid. That might be the case, unfortunately. Then Europe should be ready to risk its own defense. So there is a stock of like air defense, anti-ballistic missile ammunition preserved for the defense of NATO countries, like Germany stock of all this munitions. So Germany should be ready to risk its own security to support Ukraine, taking into account that when Russia is bogged down in Ukraine, they won't dare to do something meaningful at scale against Baltic states, for instance. So that's the only way to risk their own combat readiness, to give us, for instance, infantry fighting vehicles of Marder type, also a very good one. So that's the only possible way, plus increasing investment in Ukrainian indigenous production, which is constantly multiplying, and we're meeting our needs right now at 35-40%, especially strike capability. Also, training missions should be started to be conducted on Ukrainian territory, I mean Western missions, because right now we value this Interflex mission conducted by UK, but it takes a lot of energy, a lot of resources to bring people here and back. Plus, the environment is not fully representative of actual combat for a number of things. So it can be done quite quickly. Otherwise, frozen assets can be given to Ukraine, Russian frozen assets. It would be powerful blow to Russia, powerful boost to Ukraine in economic sense. And then, of course, increasing in Western own production and maybe trying to test the ground with the idea that Europe can procure weaponry on behalf of Ukraine, US weaponry on behalf of Ukraine, and paying the bill for this weaponry and then giving weaponry for Ukraine. So that's what can be done. Well, US has its own right to proceed in a way it deems proper, but the fact that US might now reassess its own role in a negative sense doesn't mean that it's the end of the fighting.
And, of course, we've seen the conversations evolve over the last few weeks about the coalition of the willing and the prospect of there being potentially some sort of peace force in the case of there being a ceasefire, although I think you and I have the same mind that feels like unlikely. But I wonder if you could just comment on some of the proposals that we've seen around Sky Shield or indeed this reinforcement force, as it's sometimes called, or reassurance force. Do you think that it has legs?
Well, right now I think we are in a bit vicious circle with this proposal, by which I mean that the US is saying that there should be some European proposal, which Europe tried to do jointly. But simultaneously, Europe is saying that without US backup being placed in Poland, there would be no European proposal. So there is kind of back and forth blame games that should be disrupted in this or that way. Otherwise, it's impasse, actually. With regards to the Sky Shield, that's possible, that's viable. It would take just to place a couple of squadrons properly armed with air-to-air missiles of European fighters in Poland territory, and then for sure to guarantee deconfliction, so-called, with Ukrainian land-based air defenses, not to have any kind of accident over Ukrainian skies. Because when it's crowded with missiles, UAVs, and then piloted aviation, that requires a lot of effort to ensure that friendly forces are not targeted. But it can be done, and it can strengthen Ukrainian air defense, not for sure to meet all the needs, because ballistic missiles can be intercepted with air-to-air missiles employed by piloted aviation, but cruise missiles can be targeted, UAVs can be targeted. And by the way, right now F-16s and Mirage 2000 are employed in air defense mode, actually, complementing land-based air defense. So it can be done. Otherwise, you rightly said it's a reassurance force, because thus far, as it was reported by The Telegraph among other media, these forces would be placed somewhere either in central Ukraine or in western Ukraine. It means that it would be Ukrainian defense forces who would be responsible for the immediate defense of this line of contact, the line of freezing, hypothetical one. And one of the problems that created this impasse thus far is that Europe doesn't have enough spare troops to generate even 30,000. So we are in such a state of demilitarization of Western militaries that even UK, France, Germany, which is still thinking about whether to join or not, can generate proper amount of troops. So one of the things that should be done already is to think creatively how to engage the number of troops. And it returns with the issue that weaponry and technologies are good, but it is troops who are fighting and waging wars and winning wars. So there's also another dimension. And last but not least, there is a major open question unaddressed. Let's imagine Russia would try to test all this coalition and target them with missiles, with UAVs. So first you need to bring air defense component, and then if Russia is successful, what would be this coalition of reassurance response, whether there would be a forceful response or whether there would be a retreat. So we still have a lot of known unknowns basically with these reassurance coalitions, but it should be treated as a part of the diplomatic game. So Ukraine is asked to be involved in these negotiations, and Europeans are asked to provide some blueprint of their action, how they would contribute to the stability of any settlement.
Just imagining a scenario where America does completely withdraw from the war and Europe decides to not go into Ukraine but continue to provide extensive and increased intelligence and military support in terms of munitions as well. Is that enough for Ukraine to continue fighting at its current level and indeed to improve its position?
Well, if we can ensure the simultaneous effect of provision of new aid plus addressing our structural problems with command and control manpower, that's a pretty good ground to deny Russia outright victory. So if we think about Ukrainian victory as recovery in all temporary lost territories, including those lost after 21st of February 2022, that might not be the case. But if we are talking about denying Russia victory, that is still an opportunity around which we all can be united, because Russia is not omnipotent as it wants us to believe. Yes, they would put a very confident face. They would never admit problems and mistakes and difficulties accumulating. But again, losing 400,000 dead and wounded a year, even for Russia, it's difficult. We do not know where the moment would come where Russians won't be able to sustain this level of fighting, especially with economic problems that are increasing. But we can certainly deny Russia victory. And that was, by the way, the point of the article I discussed with David last year, that we can align all the elements at the tactical, operational and strategic level in a proper way to deny Russia victory. So tactically and operational level of war, defensive mode is prevalent. Ukraine needs to wage defense, active defense. So it's already there and it's favorable to Ukraine. And then if you can sell this idea both to Ukrainian population and to our external partners and to ensure the strategic component guaranteed, then it's a good basis to deny Russia outright victory and to guarantee that if there is a settlement, and sooner or later there would be a settlement, the settlement is not the one which is dictated by Russian terms.
Bringing things slowly to a close, do you think that Ukraine has a grand strategy? And what I mean by that is that perhaps we're in phase one at the moment, which is, again, I'm just using my own terms here, containment, active defence, and trying to maintain the diplomatic ties that it currently has, with there then being, if that is successful, a phase two, which is perhaps seeing a more aggressive, hypothetically, if it's able to maintain some things. I mean, again, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth or say that I have any insights on these. I'm just merely, do you think that exists? Or do you think that, in a sense, Ukraine is just fighting on a kind of almost week by week, month by month of survival?
Well, we've seen last year an efforts to provide a coherent strategy, the so-called victory plan. But I think the problem that it didn't deliver the results people expected was because it was an ambitious plan that involved gaining, seizing and utilizing initiative and maybe recovering temporary lost territories, because it requires much more resources than our partners are ready to commit. That's one of the problems, that during these 3 years of the war, we have a different kind of series of victory. For our Western partners, especially Biden administration, victory means denying Russia victory for Ukraine. But for Ukraine, it meant recovering temporary lost territories, plus security guarantees our partners are not ready to provide. Right now, I think we, by default, are implementing this denial strategy. But the problem, I think, is that it's not properly communicated and explained especially to Ukrainian population, but also to external audiences. But simultaneously, there is a problem again when some efforts are required, when additional amount of resources are required. It's very difficult for politicians in Western countries to challenge their own population, to invest more in defense. That's one of the problems. So I think we have this kind of denial strategy by default been implemented, but it should be much better articulated and sold both to internal and external audiences to have better results.
And obviously the critique I've just made would be as valid about European capitals, that they're unable to articulate what their strategy is in this war in many senses. They say for as long as it takes, but to do what? We still don't have a clear answer to that. Perhaps we're marginally closer, but nonetheless, you'd struggle, I think, to get a prime minister to say that, yes, consistently across Europe, yes, we want to see, say, Russia defeated militarily. Some might, but others wouldn't. But there's so many different areas that one could discuss. We focus perhaps quite high strategy. I wonder if there are any subjects we've not talked about that you want to raise.
Well, we've quite thoroughly depicted the picture and all the levels of war we touched upon. So thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you very much for your time.
James Rothwell has had to leave to go back to his dispatches, so that leaves the two of us for final thoughts. James, do you want to leave us with your final thoughts?
Sure. We've talked today and this week about when and where and how potential round two of these peace talks, but there's also been a couple of reminders this week about just who Putin and the Kremlin keeps as their friends. We had a visit by Chen Wenqing, I think that's how you pronounce it. He's a member of the Chinese Politburo. He oversees legal affairs, the police and intelligence, so a very high-ranking senior member of the Chinese government in charge of security, intelligence, spying, that sort of thing. He was in town in Moscow meeting with Sergei Shoigu, the Secretary of Russia's Security Council and former defense minister. That's a reminder of the prominence of China in the Russian diplomatic outreach and how important China is for its Russia's diplomatic cover and economy. You had this Chinese intelligence chief in town. The other visitor that I want to flag up to your listeners is chairman of Yemen's Leadership Council. This is Rashad al-Alimi. He's head of the internationally recognized government of Yemen. He was in the Kremlin to talk to Putin about how to bring peace to Yemen. Now, this is a remarkable thing, given Putin and the Kremlin are sponsoring the Houthi rebels, which are against al-Alimi's own government. Now, the reason for this is that the Kremlin had taken a rather neutral stance on the whole Yemen civil war, but has been persuaded by Iran one of its key backers, sends it missiles, drones, etc., to start backing the Houthi rebels. There were reports last year that Russia had certainly given Houthi rebels location data on Western ships sailing through the Red Sea, and potentially even given them missiles to attack these ships. That was never confirmed outright. That there was a long Reuters report about this, but it was never confirmed outright. So you have the remarkable sight here, yesterday in the Kremlin, of the head of the internationally recognized government of Yemen talking to Putin to try and bring peace in Yemen, while Putin is also sponsoring the Houthi rebels. A remarkable state of affairs, and also linked to, very heavily linked to Russia's alliance with Iran. So quick reminders this week of the influence of China and Iran inside the Kremlin.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest newsletter. Each week, Dom Nichols and Francis Dearnley answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights. Plus, maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each day on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.